Good morning. I've finished my series on Paul Morphy in the First American Chess Congress, and I've finished my series on Bobby Fischer in the 1963-64 US Championships. Two fantastic performances. And so this has led me to thinking about what is the greatest performance ever. And really, it's difficult to say, but there are definitely three that stand out above all the others. That's Carlsen at Pearl Springs in 2009, uh, Gukesh Domaraju in the Olympiad last year, and Fabiano Caruana in the Sinkfield Cup, I believe it was 2017, where he won the first 7 games in a row. So I'm going to look at those three performances, but I'm just going to look at the wins from those three performances to make the series a bit shorter and a bit easier to see all three performances in uh, context. So I'm starting with Pearl Springs in 2009. Pearl Springs 2009 was a closed tournament which featured Magnus Carlsen, Peter Leko, former World Championship finalist, played in the final against Vasily Kramnik. Veselin Topolov, another World Championship finalist, played in the final against Vladimir Kramnik. Yue Wang, Chinese player, probably the weakest. Maybe Dmitry Yakovenko was the weakest player there. And Timur Radjabov, candidates finalist last year. So there was strong players, 6 strong players in the tournament, and they played each other twice with each colour. And I'm just going to concentrate on the wins. Carlsen had 6 wins out of the 10 games that were played. Obviously, 6 players, you play 5 other players twice, 10 games. Yeah, wonderful stuff, math. So we'll look at the first game from the Pearl Springs tournament of 2009. Carlsen is white and plays e4. Best by test. He doesn't always play e4, and at this time in his career, he had a tendency to play unusual stuff to get people out of their preparation and not to play the deep theoretical lines. There was some suggestion that at this time in his career, he didn't know the deep theoretical lines. That could well be true, but later in his career, he was able to beat for example, Maxime Bachir-Legrave, known as the best player with the Grunfeld, known as the world's leading Grunfeld expert, and Carlsen was able to crush him in the Grunfeld, and he was able to take players into their favourite openings later in his career and absolutely crush them. But this isn't the case in this game. He plays not so unusual, but a little bit unusual approach to the opening here. So e5 from Leko, and knight to f3, knight to c6, very normal, and the Scotch game. Interestingly enough, the Scotch game gets its name from a correspondence match which took place in 1824, over 200 years ago, and that was between the London Chess Club and the Edinburgh Chess Club. And you should think that the Edinburgh Chess Club came up with this opening, and that's why it's called the Scotch. But that's not the case at all. It was played by the London Chess Club first, but then after it being played by the London Chess Club, the Edinburgh Chess Club understood the power of the opening and played it throughout the rest of the match to big success. So it became known as the Scotch opening. As a Scotsman, I'm just going to say I always object to being called the Scotch opening. Scotch is whisky. The adjective for something from Scotland is, of course, Scots. So it should be the Scots opening. But they wanted to make it sound like the French opening, or they didn't understand their own English language. I don't know. But it's called the Scotch opening. I'm not going to start a campaign to try and get it called the Scots opening, as it should be called. But as a Scotsman, I have to mention that fact whilst I've got the chance. Anyway, the pawn is taken, and it's taken back with the knight. Again, as we looked at in the last game by Fisher, you don't take the knight here because you're just inviting the queen into the game, giving your opponent free development. Instead, he develops with an attack on that knight, and Carlsen develops with a defense, and Leko develops with another attack on the knight, and the knight is defended by the pawn, and the final knight is developed by Leko. Carlsen comes to c4 with his bishop, a great square, and the knight comes to e5. And the bishop goes to e2. Couldn't he have just gone to e2 in the first place? He could have done, but he goes to e2 now because now that he's played to e5, Leko's threatening to come to f6 and win this bishop. So it may have cost him an extra move to get to e2, but Leko has used 2 moves with his knight, so he doesn't actually lose anything by it. Queen comes to g6 to attack the g2 pawn. There's only one effective defense, which is the castle. And Leko plays d6 with the threat of developing his bishop to h3 with a threat of mate. And then, you know, the pawn is pinned to this rook here, so serious consequences for white. And really, really clever defense from Carlsen. He plays to f4 and attacks the knight at the same time. And now if the bishop comes to h3, Carlsen of course has the resource of playing the rook to f2 to defend the pawn, and the knight's still attacked. But isn't there a problem with this? He's left the pawn undefended. Yeah, and Carlsen has to retreat the bishop. Isn't this pawn hanging as well? It is, but you know, it's risky taking that pawn. So he doesn't take the risk. He takes the knight instead, takes the pawn, and now his knight's threatened by 2 different pawns. So he retreats to g6. And the pawn is defended on f4, and Leko castles. And Carlsen uses the first tempo he gains by attacking the queen. He's paid a price for that tempo. He's paid 1 pawn as the price for that tempo. But what we see, as we often see, is with Carlsen, one of the things that I admire about him most, I've got to say Carlsen is my favourite player. The interest of fairness, so maybe I'm a bit biased in my thinking about these performances and about how Carlsen plays here, but Carlsen is my favourite player. Why? Well, I think we see a good example of this here. Carlsen very quickly develops these pieces to the best square. He instinctively knows where his pieces belong and instinctively coordinates these pieces brilliantly, effectively, and quickly. And he starts by playing the pawn to d5. Why does he play the pawn to d5? There is a principle in chess that if you want to attack, then you have to have a locked centre. Okay, the centre is not locked; it's open here now. There's another principle that if you've got a pawn chain, that pawn chain will act to make it difficult for your opponent to move his pieces from one side of the board to the other. Can you call one pawn a pawn chain? Yeah, in this instance, we've got a 1 pawn chain. Plays a6, best move, so that he can play b5 in one go and then play bishop to b7. So the rook comes to the open file, takes control of the only open file. It will always have control over the only open file. King goes to h1 just to be free from attacks on f8 and such. Yeah, makes sense. And this pawn is isolated, therefore weak. One thing about the isolated pawn is that it gives you good activity with your pieces, and particularly good activity on the semi-open files to open or semi-open files to either side of the isolated pawn. So this E file is open, Carlsen has control. This C file is semi-open and in control of Carlsen with his rook on C1. Bishop comes to D7, and as soon as the bishop comes to D7, oh no, he defends the pawn first. Sorry, I thought he played the attack first. So he defends the pawn, but also opens up the rook more. And the rook comes to c8 to defend the pawn. And the queen comes to b3, a great square. Comes with tempo, attacking the pawn on b7. So the pawn comes to b5. That's good. It does defend the pawn, but you know, it does leave this pawn weak. And the weakness of this pawn will play a role in this game. So Carlsen begins maneuvering with his knight. The knight's obviously heading to d4, where it will threaten the queen and threaten to come possibly to e6, possibly to f6, possibly to f5. Queen comes to h3, and the knight goes as advertised to the fantastic square d4, and the bishop threatens the bishop, and the bishop threatens the queen. Queen and bishop form a battery, and he plays to h5, h4. This is to stop attacks from the knight and to restrict the queen a little bit more. The knight comes to g8. He wants to reorganise the knight onto the f6 square, which is reasonable. Rook comes to a6, threatens the rook comes to c6, sorry, threatens the a6 pawn, but he's also threatening at the same time the c7 pawn. So the pawns can't be defended. So the weakness of the a6 pawn comes out now. The knight comes to f6, more centralised, more advanced, better position. The pawn's taken. The bishop comes to d7, and the knight takes the pawn. Isn't that just going directly into a pin? That is just going directly into a pin. But it can be defended, and it's very difficult for Leko to put more pressure on that pinned piece. PP on the PP. Put pressure on the pinned piece. The knight comes to g4. He wants to get rid of this bishop and ensure that Carlsen no longer has the bishop pair. The knight's pinned to the queen, and the queen retreats. Queen comes to c4 to attack the pawn on c7. This sacrifice is an attempt to generate activity. Obviously, if you take the pawn here, then this square becomes weak, and yeah, you might well be suffering a terrible attack. Take this pawn, and the queen takes this pawn, and you're threatening check here, and that's difficult to deal with. So Carlsen takes out one of the attackers. Great. And no, he takes the pawn, but instead of recapturing the pawn straight away, Leko's crafty and he plays bishop to f3, so that when he takes the pawn, he's got a mate threat. He can't take the pawn, sorry, because it's covered by the bishop, so he's threatening queen to g6 to get his mate. And great defense by Carlsen. He could have tried to wriggle out with his king. I think the machine says that h2 is the best move. So you can come to h2, and then if he does play queen to g6, you can play rook to g1. So, but I really like f5. Brilliant, you know. Can't play to g6 now, covered by the pawn. Can't play to g5, covered by the pawn. No other checks possible. Love it. The queen comes to h5, but it doesn't have the threat to play check on g4, or at least it isn't an effective threat because the queen would just be taken. It's just a queen swap. Queen comes to f4, and the bishop takes the pawn on d5. And the knight takes the pawn on c7 and threatens the knight, so taking this pawn isn't going to work. The knight comes to b7, and surprise, surprise, the pin has been reversed. It's not like the rook isn't pinned to the other rook, but you understand what I'm saying. The pawn comes to f6 to allow the queen to play to f7 to come into the game again. At the moment, can't take this pawn, can't move here or it gets taken, can't play here, can't play here, can't play here, and can't play here. So he plays f6 to try and get the queen back into the game. And Carlsen centralizes his bishop, gets on its most active possible square, typical Carlsen. And he waits also with that move until the queen has already come to f7 before blocking his chances by playing knight to e6 and attacking the rook at the same time. So the rook has to go to g8 to get out of the attack, and the king, fantastic, king on f2, safest square on the board for the king. Brilliant, just brilliant. So the rook comes to c8, threatening to come to here, check, and no, you're not getting there. That file is not going to be open, says Carlsen. And the bishop comes to d5 to attack the knight. Carlsen is happy to just push the pawn, and the rook comes to c4 to attack the queen. Queen can't move, otherwise this falls, so the knight has to come to d4 to block the attack. Bishop comes to a8, stops the pawn from queening, and allows the opportunity potentially to double the pawns. Queen takes the pawn on d6. The queen comes to h5, and the queen comes to f4 to defend the pawn. And the rook goes to c8, and that's all she wrote. The machine says that rook to b8 is a better move, but it's going to be very, very difficult for Leko to stop the back rank threats from Carlsen here. Yeah, and that is what decides the game, and Leko resigned here. It might look like it's a bit premature, but analyse this, put on the analysis on this position when I went through it before recording this, and it said it's about +6 to Carlsen, but I'm not going to go through the lines. I like to encourage people to think for themselves, so I'd like you to think for yourself, why is this such a crushing position for white? What is it that white can do that black can't stop that will win him this game? Yeah? Okay. That was the first win for Carlsen from the Pearl Springs tournament in 2009. Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks for today. Bye.